it's strange to think this is now our 6th online webinar event, and it's our fourth webinar with a couple of workshops as well, with more to come, an event each month, right up till March in the first instance. I'm delighted today that to be joined by colleagues from Scottish Recovery Network. We've got Louise Christie and Hannah Kane from Scottish Recovery Network, and also colleagues from NHS Lanarkshire. So we've got Lucy McIntyre and Elizabeth Ogston from NHS Lanarkshire, who are going to give us an overview of probably one of the most interesting pieces of work round about personality disorder that I think we've heard about in the programme. Very innovative in genuinely putting people with lived experience and who access services at the heart of that process. So the webinar is entitled "Moving from Consultation to Co-Design: Putting Lived Experience at the Heart of Mental Health Support," and speaks about the collaboration between those three parties: SRN, People with Lived Experience, and NHS Lanarkshire, in looking at how to genuinely co-design services for people who might attract a diagnosis of personality disorder. So I'll do a very quick bit of housekeeping, and then we can crack on. So for people who are not familiar with Teams, along the top bar you'll see a chat function, there's a polls function, stuff like that. We ask for everyone to keep their camera off and their mic muted, just to save on bandwidth. It helps everything else go a wee bit more smoothly if we're not using up quite so much of the bandwidth on Teams. If anyone has any questions that they would like to ask, we'll have the kind of Q&A bit will be at the end. We've got a fairly big chunk of time. We've got 20 minutes allocated for question and answers at the end. So if anyone has got any questions, please put them in the chat box, and we'll compile them all, and the speakers will be able to answer all those questions at the end. And if we don't have time to answer all the questions, we'll do a Q&A handout that we'll send out to everyone that's attending. We will be recording the event, and we'll do a bit of polling for kind of evaluation how things went towards the end. I think that's more than enough for me, so I'm going to hand over to our colleagues from SRN and NHS Lanarkshire. Thank you.
Thanks, Gordon. So hi everyone, I'm Hannah. I'm one of the network officers for Scottish Recovery Network, and we're really happy to be here today to chat about the work that we've done in Lanarkshire. So this project really put lived experience at the heart of co-designing mental health support. As Gordon said, it was a project where we tried a new approach that seemed to work really well, and the approach is a simple one really. It's just going back to human connection, collaboration, and really building and investing in those relationships. So that will be the main theme of our conversation today. But before I get ahead of myself, I'm going to pass over to Liz from NHS Lanarkshire, who's going to give us a wee bit of background to the project and how it came to be. So over to you, Liz. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Hannah. My name is Liz Ogston. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Personality Disorder Strategy Group in NHS Lanarkshire. My background is medical psychotherapy and group analysis. The Personality Disorder Strategy Group was formed in 2018 in NHS Lanarkshire, and I'm just going to say a little bit about diagnosis. The term personality disorder, just want to say we were very aware that's very contentious in an area of complex emotional needs and can sometimes exclude or add to stigma. We discussed this in very initial groups and tried to consider all aspects of it, but we had followed at present the MIND consensus document and some guidance from the British IELTS group for the study of personality disorder. These are both online if anybody's interested to have a look, and they both use the phrase people who may attract a diagnosis of personality disorder as sort of one option, and inclusive, to try to be as inclusive as possible while recognising it's not ideal to. Some people find it helpful to have a label, some people don't, and it's just to recognise that, obviously. And both of those approaches that I mentioned from Mind Consensus had experts with experience contributing to, and also the British IELTS group with for study of personality disorder welcomes that too. So just to say a little bit about that term, but I think I'll just refer to it as the strategy group going forward. So the purpose of our strategy group was to try to coordinate and form a regional strategy for NHS Lanarkshire, and eventually an integrated care pathway for those who may attract this diagnosis and services. Now, there had been previous attempts to form an ICP in Lanarkshire in years gone by, but this hadn't really taken off, and there had been issues around funding which had stopped a specialist service in the past. So what we tried to do was form a group from the service provider side to look at it, include as many disciplines as possible within mental health and to be multidisciplinary. And our group were very cognisant, particularly of two national documents as the group was forming. And these are it's called Personality Disorder in Scotland, Raising Awareness, Expectations and Hope by Royal College of Psychiatrists, and also Living with Borderline Personality Disorder by the Mental Welfare Commission, both available. The next slide, please. There's three main areas of work. I will say that right from the first meetings that we had as professionals, we were interested in gaining the perspective of experts by experience, people with lived experience, and we had to take some time to consider how to best do that. Other areas of work, we started to scope out what services were available from just asking service providers involved in the group. And that also included a review of any adverse incidents and learning points from that. Secondly, delegates from our strategy group contacted and visited other Scottish health boards and went and asked what their approaches were and how they're were compiling integrated care pathways for patients that might track this diagnosis. But arguably most important, the third area was that we're working on is that we knew that we wanted to involve experts by experience and their carers, but we had to think carefully about the best way to do this. Lucy McIntyre, who's my co-chair of the strategy group, and approached a contact through CME Scotland, who suggested the Scottish Recovery Network. We were then delighted to meet with Louise and Hannah from the SRM, and we could see that they had a lot of experience in this area and knew the best ways to give us ideas and advice on how to engage experts by experience, people that were living with that, who may be in the service or may not chosen to be in the service, but might have some valuable guidance to give us, and also through involvement of the third sector. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that other areas while we were working on with learning about the Scottish Recovery Network's approach, we realised that we wouldn't be able to form any sort of recommendations really for the ICP without proper involvement, lived experience. So we're setting up that project was one of our priorities, and some work that was going on in the background. We were keeping going with the scoping work, looking into that, and had obviously realised there's a big overlap with the trauma, people with lived experience of trauma. And we did link with the NHS Lanarkshire Trauma Strategy Group, and we received a visit and update from Claire Stark to hear about NHS Education for Scotland's trauma training strategy to the group. And this had come out for our discussions about that I'd mentioned earlier about diagnostic labels, which some people find helpful and some less so. So we also supported a recommendation for learning for staff, that should come from the strategy group about trauma-informed practice, which was fine. So that's I had to share it at the moment. So thank you for listening. I'll hand back to Hannah.
Thank you, Liz. I think that set the scene really nicely, and it's really useful to know the kind of background as to why the project came to be. So how did we become involved? Well, at Scottish Recovery Network, we're always looking for ways to promote and support mental health recovery. Our vision is that together we can make Scotland a place where people expect mental health recovery and are supported at all stages of their recovery journey. And part of that mission is that we want to bring people, services and organisations across all of the sectors together to create a mental health system that's really powered by lived experience, which also supports people's recovery journey. So collaboration and lived experience, they really are central to the work that we do. So when Liz and Lucy approached us looking for some guidance around lived experience engagement, we saw it as a really good opportunity to support them to engage in a way that developed their own capacity for future engagement, but it would also be a really great learning opportunity for us around engaging with a particular and often contested diagnosis. Next slide, please. So to set the scene, the overarching aim for the project was for lived experience to work in collaboration with NHS Lanarkshire to contribute to the design of services and supports for people living with complex mental health issues who may attract a diagnosis of personality disorder. So we were really deliberate in our wording there not to make it so stringent that you must have a diagnosis to take part, because it really excludes a lot of people. So we worded it in a way to make sure we got the right people with the right experience without excluding many others. And to start the project off, we reached out to many local organisations across Lanarkshire to introduce the work that we were planning to do and to make connections. We invited both organisations and people with lived experience along to an information session, and this was for two reasons. One was obviously to share information about the project, but the second and probably the most important reason is because we wanted to model collaboration from the very beginning of the project right through to the end. So half of the information session was spent in conversation with the participants, asking them, how should we engage with lived experience? For the organisations that were there, we asked them what would work best for their members, and was there any barriers to participation that we should be addressing? And we got really great feedback and learning from this. And I think a lot of buy-in as well, because we showed people that we aren't just here to do things our way and it's up to you to get involved. We instead acknowledged that they were the experts in this and we took time to learn from them. And I think also building those connections with the third sector and having them as a key part of the project meant that we were meant to reach so many people with lived experience. So taking the learning from the information session, this really shaped the first stage of our project, which was all about having conversations with people to find out what keeps them well and what helps their recovery. So having asked people how they wanted us to engage with them, they said that choice and options were really important. So that's what we done. We had a variety of different ways for people to share their views. We ran conversation cafes, we had local organisations in Lanarkshire run their own cafes and also have discussions with their members in a way that suited them. And we also gave people the option to get in touch one-to-one to talk about their views. And this could be done through a survey, email, text, phone call, Teams or Zoom. We really just wanted to keep it as open as possible so people could get involved in a way that suited them. So I'll send out a link to our Recovery Conversation Cafe toolkit following the event so you can read more about it. But this is the approach that we used for essentially all of the engagement in this project. This approach is one that addresses the power imbalances that we find in traditional consultation, and it instead provides a really structured space for people to share their experiences and share what's important to their recovery. We found that traditional consultation tends to focus on gaps and feedback about current services, and that can really limit people's contribution. So instead, we try and take a future focused approach and ask people, what matters most to them and what type of support do people need to stay well and live a good life. One thing I'll say to everyone at the start of our sessions is, try and have a blank slate, think outside the box, and don't be scared to dream big, because actually when we say that, some of the big ideas that people have, they aren't that unrealistic, and they're things that, they don't cost a lot of money. So don't be scared to ask people what they really want. So following this conversation stage, some key approaches started to emerge, which I'm going to speak more about in a wee minute. But what we've done was we shared these with everyone who took part in the conversations, because it's really important for people to know how their contributions are being used. So this was our first stage all around conversations. We then moved on to the co-design stage. So we hosted 2 sessions in partnership with NHS Lanarkshire, one online and one in person. And using those key approaches that we identified, we began making practical plans for how a great service would look. And we used a co-design approach because we believe that a recovery-focused mental health system should be powered by lived experience. These sessions were another great opportunity to strengthen those relationships between NHS, third sector and people with lived experience. And people really valued having NHS staff there, and they fed back that they felt listened to and that their voice mattered. And again, once we had all this information, we collated it all and shared it with those who took part. And then finally, to end the project, we had a couple of review sessions. So these were an opportunity to go over the final report and just ensure that it reflected what we discussed and agreed. But we were also able to reflect on the process and chat about what worked well and what we still had to develop. And interestingly enough, one thing that came back was people didn't really feel the review session was necessary, and it was actually the lowest attended sessions that we had. People felt like they had plenty of opportunity to review the write-ups throughout the project, and they were happy with the level of participation they were offered. And at these sessions, we also discussed how the connections can be maintained, just so we can make sure the conversation continues. And we've agreed to do a 6-month follow-up review going forward. This way, NHS Lanarkshire can update people on their progress, whilst also allowing people, excuse me, the opportunity to ask questions and give their feedback. This was something that came up quite a lot throughout the conversations. People were saying, you know, we get that things take time, but an update just to say that nothing's happened is better than being kept in the dark. So this was really important to us to offer the opportunity for people to be updated on what's happening with their contributions. So that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the project. Wee bit of self-promo. We do have a podcast and a report launching during co-production week at the end of November. So I would really encourage you to sign up to our newsletter to hear about it. I'll send out the link after the session. You can read a wee bit more about the process for the project. Next slide, please. So, as I said, from the conversation stage, 3 key approaches emerged really strongly. And I'm just going to go over these briefly, but they are covered a wee bit more in depth in the report. So the first thing that emerged from the discussions was the need for genuinely trauma-informed care, which is embedded at all levels of services and support. Adopting a trauma-informed approach will lead to better experiences of engagement and also improved outcomes for people with lived experience. This approach would involve collaboration. People should feel empowered and be able to use their own experiences to make informed decisions about their care. And it would also involve humility and responsiveness. What we mean by that is that the stigma and discrimination around the diagnosis personality disorder would be acknowledged and addressed. And by acknowledging the impact that trauma can have on a person, we can really help shift these stigmatising attitudes towards people who experience complex mental health problems. And lastly, in this approach, there would be a focus on safety. People should feel physically and psychologically safe, and so steps should be taken to ensure that people aren't re-traumatised when they're accessing support. So the next thing that people felt they would benefit from was a truly person-centred approach, keyword there being truly. People want consistency from clinicians and care providers, as building relationships and connections truly are key for recovery. They want a commitment to ongoing and consistent support, because that will lead to people having better relationships with services rather than being seen as problematic and excluded from the care and support that they need. Support should be flexible and based on what people need at that moment of time, and not simply based on their diagnosis or their history. And finally, support should be offered on an ongoing basis to help reduce that cycle of referrals and people being passed pillar to post. Support should not be time limited from the outset, as this can put pressure on people to feel like they need to be fixed by this time, and if they aren't, then they'll be left with no support. And this is not person-centred care when it looks like this. And then finally, we spoke about how a whole person, whole systems approach would benefit the people of Lanarkshire. Taking this approach means that people would be connected to other services who can provide financial, social and emotional support. And people wouldn't feel like when they're accessing third sector support that it's one or the other. Instead, third sector support would be seen as complementary to the support that people receive from the NHS. There would also be a focus on peer support, as we know that connecting with others who've got similar experiences is important to people and it benefits recovery. Especially with trauma, you know, it can be reassuring to be with people who identify with the experiences that you've had in a really safe and supportive environment. And finally, considerations would be also made for supporters of people with complex mental health problems. And what we mean by that is family, friends and carers who are a really important part of the whole person, whole system approach, but they're often overlooked. Reassurance should be offered to them alongside an empathetic approach when we're speaking to supporters. So these were the three main approaches that emerged from our conversations, and these then went on to inform the development of our ideas for how services could best support people. Next slide, please. So as I said, at the co-design session, we came up with many ideas, but these were the 4 ideas that we collectively felt were the most important to the improvement and development of mental health services and supports. So the first idea that we had was a drop-in wellbeing hub. So this would be a drop-in hub hosted by NHS Lanarkshire, which would work in partnership with local third sector organisations to offer a variety of emotional, practical and social support. People would be able to attend the hub with no appointment. And this came from people sharing the stress of trying to stick to appointments and the negative impact that it has on their support if they don't attend appointments. People would be able to find out what local support is in their area, how they can access it. It would really just be like a one-stop shop for support. And there would also be peer workers based within the hub, as we know that connecting with people who've got similar experiences promotes recovery. So the next idea that we had was around coordination of services and support. And this idea came from people feeling alone when they were trying to figure out what support was available in their local community and just feeling like they were knocking on every door trying to get help and it was taking a real toll on them. So we came up with this idea of integrating peer navigators into mental health services, which means there would be an allocated person who can support people accessing the services by linking them in with complementary support in the community. The navigators will take a measured approach to support, working with the person to agree goals, identify what support's needed and developing a care plan together. And this holistic approach would ensure that people are receiving truly person-centred care with that added peer element which we know benefits recovery. Another idea that we had was around collaborative and holistic approach to care planning. So NHS would collaborate with people with lived experience to create a holistic care planning document. It would provide a blueprint of history, difficulties, strengths and goals. People would be able to review and update their document regularly, allowing for a really flexible approach to support. And using that document would mean that people can meaningfully collaborate on the care planning process and be supported to make informed decisions about their care. And the last idea that we had was training that is co-produced and co-delivered. And this idea came from us trying to address stigmatising attitudes towards people who have got a personality disorder diagnosis. So we would look to create a short training course that is co-produced and co-delivered by people with lived experience and NHS staff. The training would look to increase staff's understanding of trauma and the way that people present when they're in crisis. And we recognise the role that burnout and compassion fatigue can have when staff exhibit stigmatising attitudes. So there would also be modules in the training that focus on staff wellbeing and emotional resilience. So that was the main ideas that we had for developing mental health support and services. And interestingly enough, although we aren't at the co-design stage of the project that we're doing for the Personality Disorder Improvement Programme, the concept of a drop-in wellbeing hub is being brought up at some of the conversation cafes and the one-to-ones that we've been doing. So it's really interesting to see how the ideas in Lanarkshire are also reflected in the kind of wider ideas that Scotland's got. So again, that was a wee bit of a whistle-stop tour of the findings, but more information in the report. And I'm now going to hand over to Lucy, who's going to chat a wee bit about how the information that we've gathered is going to be used, and also chat a wee bit more about her learnings and reflections from the project. So over to you, Lucy, and next slide.
Thanks for that, Hannah. I can't actually see the presentation, so I'm flying blind here, so keep me right if I'm wrong page here. My name is Lucy McIntyre. I'm a consultant clinical psychologist with NHS Lanarkshire and co-chair of the NHS Lanarkshire PD strategy group with Liz. Thanks very much for that, Hannah. It's a really good run through of work that we've done. And I guess the question is, what next for us in NHS Lanarkshire? As Liz has outlined already, the initial aim of the PD strategy group was to update the care pathway for people who experience the kinds of difficulties which might attract a diagnosis of personality disorder. And we've done this by viewing existing services in Lanarkshire, scoping what we have, linking in with other health boards to find out what's provided in other parts of Scotland, and engaging with people with lived experience in third sector organisations for their views on service pathways. And obviously for the lived experience thread of this, our plan is to use the findings from our partnership work with the SRN to shape the pathway going forward. There's obviously some, there's some ambitious hopes and dreams there, and got a lot of great feedback, some of which will be more feasible than others, but it really is our intention to try and include as much as we can going forward. We're also fortunate that the Health Improvement Scotland PD Improvement Programme, who's hosting today's webinar, was set up during the time that our group was meeting, and we'll be looking to the outcomes of the work that they do to help shape the pathway as well. And we're aware that the PDIP group are working with Scottish Recovery Network and Vox Scotland to ensure a meaningful representation of experience as well. We're also very keen to continue our work with the Scottish Recovery Network. The experience has been so positive and we've learned so much from it that we're very keen to continue to be guided by their expertise. As Hannah said, we've got a 6-month review meeting arranged, and we will continue to meet as the PD strategy group to think about the best way to incorporate the findings of the work that we've done. And we were also very pleased to be involved in a recent Scottish Recovery Network podcast outlining our experiences of this work. I think Hannah will maybe working alongside individuals with lived experience and third sector organisations who are involved. And finally, we're very keen to keep lived experience on the agenda. I think this work has really highlighted the value of hearing non-NHS perspectives on what good services might look like, and doing that in a meaningful way. It can sometimes feel tokenistic, talking about lived experience, so we're really keen to try and make it meaningful. And this process has really been steeped in the language and culture of how lived experience can contribute, and it's made it easier to raise lived experience on other agendas as well. Although we're very aware that there are good examples of lived experience being incorporated into NHS services already. We're very much still learning, and we're aware that there are other services ahead of us here, but we're enjoying learning as we. Please could I have the next slide, and I'll just assume it's up. I'm getting a nod from Hannah. So what did we learn? I think one of the main learning points for us was really the benefit of collaboration. Certain words become well used in different cultures, and consultation is a word often used in the NHS. It's common to ask people to provide feedback appropriately, I might say, on plans or processes, on services that have already been laid out. And our work with the SRN highlighted that in order to obtain meaningful perspectives, it makes sense to engage in a discussion about what good services might look like first, rather than us creating a pathway and then asking for feedback on it. And historically, we've kind of found that meaningful feedback from people using NHS mental health services can actually be quite difficult to obtain. It tends to capture a small percentage of the total, and it often captures quite polarized views. So people that have had very bad experiences or people that have had very, very good experiences. So this was a really nice way of having conversations that led to ideas and themes, which created the proposals and the suggestions that Hannah's outlined, rather than us coming up with a plan and asking for feedback on that. And the SRN were really good in guiding us to move from this idea of passive responders to active participants, and that really helped to shape the outcome. And this work also enabled us to have a much wider reach. As I've said, it can be difficult to gather feedback from people using services. And again, as Hannah has sort of pointed out, they were able to use their existing network and links with third sector services and reach out to many more people using social media through Facebook, Twitter, and then create a number of forums for people to feedback through email, telephone, face-to-face, conversation cafes. A much wider scope than we would have been able to engage with on our own. And they were very slick with all the comms and social media in a way that we weren't. They've also encouraged us to keep quite a broad scope from the outset, and not to narrow things down to just PD diagnosis. And that was a helpful piece of advice, I think, and it's enabled us to gain a sort of wider and richer sense of what people think services with complex mental health difficulties might look like. There's also been quite a lot of reflection on our own service. I guess when it's held up and you're hearing about your own services, you can't help but reflect on it, and that's usually a healthy thing, I think. And it's perhaps easier for people to be candid and honest about services if they're not being asked by representatives of those services. So as a non-NHS organisation, the Scottish Recovery Network was able to provide forums both with and without NHS staff, so that staff presence didn't act as a barrier to people taking part. And that was helpful in reminding us of the power dynamic that can be perceived by having a title or a badge or a uniform, or simply working for an organisation like the NHS. And I keep hearing Louise's voice in my head of just take your lanyard off, and and that's quite an interesting piece of advice for NHS staff who are conditioned to always have staff ID and their titles are always introduced. But it's really powerful in making this a conversation between people, rather than between clinician and patient, or NHS and third sector, or staff and service user. And it was also good for us to reflect on how services, which are often set up with the intention of being supportive, can actually feel unsupportive at times to people using them. For example, having time limits, or not having continuity of staff, as Hannah mentioned, being discharged if certain criteria are met. Again, good for us to reflect on people struggle with, as well as what people found helpful. And finally, it's really helped us to learn about a number of third sector services providing support for people in Lanarkshire, some of which we weren't actually aware of. And one of the conversation cafes, we were really struck by people representing services that we didn't know about, that were doing really good work and sort of filling gaps that we were unaware of. So we can see real value in keeping up with these services, learning more about them in a reciprocal way in future. So I'll hand back over to you now.
Thank you, Lucy. Next slide, please. So rather than me just chat about my own reflections on the project, I really wanted you to hear from the main people who are involved in making this project a success, and that's the people with lived experience. So I've got a little sneak peek from our podcast, and we're going to hear from Dom and Brian. Just an aside, I'm really sorry for anyone that needs subtitles or BSL interpretation. We will have it for the final podcast. I've just stole this little sneak peek before the final podcast has been edited, but we will have it for the launch later on this month. So if we could have the video played, please. Well, I can see that some people in the chat couldn't see it. Really sorry about that. We will, if we're able to send a link to this, I'm not sure if we'll be able to send a link to this short clip, but I certainly will try. And I just hope that you're able to hear it so you could get the kind of key messages that Dom and Brian were sharing. So I just want to pick up on something that Dom said, which really links to my own reflections when he said about having the right person to be doing the engagement. You know, I feel that really links to power imbalances, which is something that we try to address within our approach. The reason that we use our conversation cafe approach is because it addresses power imbalance really well. Like Lucy said, even simple things like taking your lanyard off when you're having the conversation, it makes a massive difference. I always say to people, just bring yourself to the table rather than your job role, because it makes it a lot easier for people to be able to engage with you. And for me, I think my learning from this project has been just to never underestimate the power of human connection. I feel like we sometimes have got so much on our plates, especially in this online world, because we're just flipping from one meeting to another so quickly that we forget that we're all just human. I think taking an extra couple of online meetings to build relationships with people before they then felt comfortable coming along to some of the events was massive. Even just offer to stay behind if anyone wants a chat. It shows people how much you care and how much you really want them to be able to take part. I feel building relationships was such an important part of this project, and I think what shows how much it works is that we've got many people who took part in this project now heavily involved in other pieces of work that we're doing. So I would just say, remember that building relationships and trust is a really valuable resource in itself, and one that we should all be investing time in doing. I think kindness, empathy, and truly listening to people, they don't cost anything, but they make the biggest difference when it comes to engagement. Next slide, please. So what next for the project? Well, as we mentioned, we will be doing the 6-month follow-up review session, as it's important to keep people updated on how their feedback's being used. We've also got the podcast and some additional materials launching during co-production week at the end of the month. And we're also delivering the lived experience engagement element of the Personality Disorder Improvement Programme. We're doing this in collaboration with Vox Scotland, and we've called this the With Us For Us project. So the work that we're doing here is really building on the things that people told us in Lanarkshire, and we've actually taken a lot of learning from the Lanarkshire work into this project, which has been a really nice transition. So just before we move to the Q&A, I just really want to thank you all for coming along and listening. Thank you to Liz and Lucy for co-presenting. I really hope that you've learned something new today, just about a different approach to engagement and code design. So we'll now move over to the Q&A part of today. Thanks, everyone.
Waiting a minute for the rapturous applause to come up on the screen. That was fantastic, guys. Thanks very much for that. Really, we knew it was going to be really informative because, you know, there's fantastic information in there, but it was, I think it also came across in a really human way as well. Just the importance of this work, and I think from everybody's perspective, I think from obviously from SRN and Vox to the folk from NHS Lanarkshire, it was great to hear from Dom and others, and the wee video clip. I look forward to seeing more of that. So I personally found it fantastic. I think there's a huge amount in there in that particular project, but also, as you say, you know, it's not an accident that we get you guys involved to work in the programme and really get to the heart of the experience of people who are using services or might attract the diagnosis and whatever. Round about the language, it's about engaging with people, and I think sometimes terms and diagnoses can get in the way of some of that stuff. But that was fantastic. It might be useful for people to hear that in terms of where we're at with our programme, you know, I don't want to second guess what the analysis from all of our board visits and all of the work that SRN and Vox are doing. But what we're hearing loud and clear is the importance of having those voices at the centre of planning the steps ahead. I think in particular things around about peer support for supporters. I think I saw someone refer it to in the chat. That stuff's so absolutely crucial to how we see the potential phase 2 of this programme looking in terms of implementing those approaches nationally. But anyway, so that's my observation on that, and a wee bit just about how that fits into a broader programme. So we've got a few questions. So give me a minute while I do my headless chicken and look in a separate screen to see. Right. So I think Liz, you were going to answer a couple of questions. Do you want to come in?
Thank you. Yes. Do you want to read the questions, Gordon, or is that?
Okay. So I think we'd spoke about. So Dawn had asked, are there treatments in place for those who have been re-traumatised in services, commonly referred to as iatrogenic harm? Wondering how we can expect people to feel safe approaching services if this is the main issue they're struggling with, and goes on a bit. So there was that question, and I think someone had mentioned a bit round about the feeling as if they've been let down over a period of time. So there's perhaps a theme within there that it would be useful maybe to speak to.
I'll answer Dawn's query first, if that's okay. Thank you for sharing that, Dawn. Short answers, I don't know specific treatments available, but certainly it could be part of general treatment that people are having, and to talk about their experiences. I would be hopeful that we could go forward in a trauma-informed way, and as I say, while this work was ongoing with conversation cafes and things, we were hearing a bit from NHS Education Scotland about trauma-informed approaches. So that's kind of what I would hope when moving forward, the strategy group can support that in teaching and training of staff. I think Lucy maybe addressed some of the points too, and when we were receiving feedback, obviously some of that is, you know, people have not had good experiences. We understand that and we want to hear. I think the SRN has been very helpful to allow a safe space where people can share that, maybe not directly with NHS staff there and things. So yeah, I'm really sorry to read of people in the chat sharing comments where they've really just not had a positive experience at all, and I'm sorry to hear that. We're trying to do our best to involve people going forward and to try and make our services trauma informed and responsive. We'll be a wee bit limited, I think, in terms of funding things. I don't know, sometimes to the question about what might be possible going forward, but there's certainly things that we can support, take forward and advocate for that are not costing as well, you know. So I think our overall message would be, you know, we accept that things haven't maybe been good for some people, and we're trying to learn from that, and we're trying to move forward and learning from people during their view. Thank you.
Okay. I noticed there's a question which asks, hello, it's very interesting talk, thank you. I was wondering if the service design is redesigning of current services, or is this a new standalone service? Anyone from the panel fancy a crack at that one?
I can respond to that. Just to say, it's not a standalone service. We did have an integrated care pathway, but it wasn't really living and breathing pathway, and we were, the point of the strategy group was to redevelop that, and that's what this has all been about. It's about redeveloping that pathway. So we're not creating a different standalone service. We are trying to create a pathway within the services that we have that reflects the feedback that we've got from the SRN, from groups doing, from the boards services. I hope that.
I think you cut out just a wee bit towards the end there, Lucy. So there's a couple of questions that talk about how, whether these supporters groups are going to be set up, and other things about how this has been replicated elsewhere in the country. That speaks a wee bit, I think, to what I'd mentioned just after the presentations around about the whole point of our improvement programme. And for people who maybe not been at previous events, or it might be useful for me to talk a wee bit about that. I don't want to take up too much time away from this Q&A, but I think it seems pertinent just now. So our programme was set up and runs till March in the first instance, and our task was to find out what the current landscape was for service provision for people that might attract a diagnosis of personality disorder in Scotland. We are conducting a strategic gap analysis by visiting every board in the country, finding out how they do things, what the challenges are, what's working well. We are doing lots of staff engagement work to find out what the staff experience has been like, and as a huge part of the programme, we commissioned SRN and Vox to undertake a national level piece of work which mirrors some aspects of this piece of work, a bit really hearing about people's experience and looking for ideas and how we can make services better. In addition to that, we've got this learning system where we have opportunities for people to come together, to network, to ask questions, to hear from other people's experience, to lift that, and to further develop services, and a large part for us to inform what our outcomes are going to be at the end of this, and our recommendations will be at the end of the programme. We are still doing lots of analysis from the huge amount of information that we've gathered together. But as I said earlier, there are key themes developing. One of them is about the absolute importance of people with lived experience involved in service design, how we look at the at peer support, and a number of different other ways where all of this work speaks directly to what our likely recommendations to Scottish Government will be for phase 2, which will be post-March. So I would think it highly likely that we would make a recommendation, for example. Don't this is any, no great giveaways here, nothing contentious about it. We'll be making a recommendation that there are opportunities for peer support across the board and all of the kind of health board. I say health board areas. I mean, that refers to health and social care partnerships and stuff as well. But I think that's critically important, that people are able to have that level of support, that kind of intuitive level of support from people who understand implicitly the experiences that other people are having. There'll be lots more. Clearly, the SRN and Vox were colleagues that are still working on that and still to come to the report stage with that work as well. But that will all feed in as a very significant aspect of our programme. And again, as someone who's worked clinically in this area, I always find it really difficult to hear when people feel as if they've been let down and services haven't been up to the level or standard that people would expect. But programmes like this, they're all about acknowledging that services maybe haven't been perfect, but it's about having a real desire to improve, and that's on a national level, percolating down into people's individual lives. That's the critical thing about this programme. It's about having a genuine will and enthusiasm for improving our responses in this area, and I'm really reassured that that's something that I've heard, I think, in every group that we've engaged with across the country. There's a real enthusiasm to improve. Enough from me. Are there, from the panel, are there any other volunteers to answer any of the questions that we've got here?
I just wonder, Gordon, if people maybe even find it interesting just for me to quickly give a wee kind of update on where we're at with the lived experience element for the personality disorder improvement programme.
I think that'd be really useful for I think, and what we can do with any of the other questions that's there that people haven't had a direct response to, we can fill out that Q&A stuff, and we can send that out to everyone, so everyone will get an answer to their question.
So the lived experience engagement work that we're doing for the PDIP, it is very, very similar to the work that we're doing we've done in Lanarkshire. So to answer that question, it is kind of been carried out in other health boards, because we're doing this as a Scotland-wide engagement piece rather than just locally in Lanarkshire. So what we've done today is we've completed that conversation stage. We've done the engagement. We've spoke to people to find out, what matters most to them, what's the key issues that people are facing, and what would help their recovery. And happening this month, actually, we're doing the co-design stage. So we've got an online co-design session and a couple of in-person ones as well, where we'll take people through that process of just pulling out what is the key approaches and key issues that they want to tackle, I suppose, and then we'll work on ideas for how do we address it, what's the proposals for making these improvements and creating change. So that's kind of where we're at just now in this project. But an added element of the work that we're doing here that we didn't do in Lanarkshire that I just really want to highlight is we created a lived experience project group. I can see a couple of them in the chat, so we shout out to you. But that really came from in Lanarkshire. It almost happened a little bit naturally in Lanarkshire. Some of the one-to-ones that I was having with folk, they were saying, if you thought about doing this, giving ideas for how we run the event, ideas for how we phrase the questions. So for this project, we decided to formalise it a wee bit more, and we offered the opportunity for people with lived experience to join our project group, and they've been involved in helping us plan the sessions. They're going to be involved in helping us interpret some of the responses, interpreting the report, We've also done some training together in photo voice, which has been great because we're now going to be creating some sort of creative videos, resources, animations, things like that for this group to really amplify their voices and the key messages that they've got for the project. So it's been really nice to have this added element to the project. Again, just like giving a massive platform for lived experience, having them be involved in the planning and the direction of the work. And I feel like once we get to the end of this project, I'm sure we'll have even more learning to share with you around how that group works, and how it created change. So yeah, that's where we're at with the work that we're doing now, and I'm really excited because a lot of great things has came from it already.
That's brilliant, Hannah. Thanks a lot. Right, so we will respond to all of the other questions in a kind of written Q&A response from our panel, and we'll send it out to everyone that's been on the call. What I'd like to do just now is just if we can move over to the slides for our poll. If people could just respond to these, that'd be great. Thanks. It will come up on the screen for a period of time, but then it'll be in the chat, so you can click the box just to help us with evaluation, which is really useful to help us shape how any of these future events go. Okay, that's great. So the questions will all be in the chat, and I think they'll remain in the chat so people can go back to those if you don't quite have the time to get it while they're on the screen. Okay. So I think with the polls coming up, I think that kind of only really leaves me just to once again to thank everyone that's been involved in presenting, the guys behind the scenes that made the webinar happen, and especially to the, I think, 160 plus people who attended today, and thanks very much for your questions, your interest. There are further learning system events coming up all the way through into March and hopefully beyond. And I think there's something for everyone, I think, in the workshops and the webinars. I mean, some of them might seem as if they're maybe more focused for other groups of people, but we absolutely want as broad an attendance at these events as possible, and we really want to hear from everyone. So with that in mind, as a reminder, the next workshop is going to be on the 6th of December, and there'll be information coming out if you're on the mailing list around about that. So thanks very much for everyone, to everyone. See you at the next event.